Okay, I want to talk a bit about a law that's just been passed in France, which is going to criminalise clients of sex workers. I probably referred a bit to this in some recent videos, which I laid out my stance on prostitution. Feel free to look at those videos. I argued that I believe that whilst it's not a good thing in its own right, I believe the arguments for legalising prostitution are stronger than the arguments against making it illegal. In this particular case, I'd like to lay out why I think it's wrong to criminalise clients. The theory seems to go, I know this is the case in Sweden, and I imagine this is what's just happened in France, that clients have the upper hand, they have the power. I'm going to argue in this video why I don't believe that is the case. First of all, we can't generalise all clients. I don't know the individual reasons why all these men, obviously they all want sex, but there's different reasons I believe that is motivating these men to go to a sex worker as opposed to conventional sex. And I dispute that they have the upper hand. I think one major issue that is overlooked here is the issue of involuntary celibacy or perpetual celibacy. That is the phenomenon of people being in a situation where for one reason or another they cannot have sexual intimacy. They don't have the opportunity to have sexual intimacy. And I believe that many men who visit sex workers are doing it as a last resort because they literally have no other way they can see of getting sexual intimacy. Now, first of all, I think most people would agree that sexual intimacy is a basic human desire that most people desire. From that point of view, as far as I'm concerned, it is a human right. You might laugh at that, but you have to consider the psychological impact of suffering perpetual celibacy. It remains a great taboo of our time. It's something that can cause immense loneliness, mental anguish, and I believe depression, of course, collectively serious mental health problems, because you are marginalised. I have experienced this. It's no longer my situation, but for years I struggled with this, and I'll be honest, the thought crossed my mind to visit a sex worker. Now that never happened, it came to me in another way, which I'm not going to go into details about, but the thought crossed my mind. I didn't do it because in my country, I live in the UK, it's illegal to pay for sex. In France, it was legal to buy and sell sex, but now it's illegal to buy sex. To me, that's stupid, criminalising half of the party. And I think sex workers themselves would say that they're losing business as a result. Now, there's a stereotype about clients as these desperate, they're often portrayed as middle-aged men who are sort of powerful businessmen type. Feminists tend to portray them as really chauvinistic, sleazy people. The truth is, I think most men who visit sex workers are normal men who have the same emotions and challenges as almost everyone else. In terms of these people having the upper hand, well, there's a financial perspective, and it's a serious point, that is how much the sex worker charges. In some circumstances, it's not a little bit of money, it's quite a substantial amount of money, in which case she is getting the financial means. She is being paid for a service. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. That's why I've heard feminists call it rape. I utterly reject that, and I think it actually trivialises actual rape. Now, I want to make this clear. I do not believe that prostitution is an ideal situation. In an ideal world, it wouldn't exist at all. There wouldn't be a situation whereby men felt they had to go to a sex worker, and women wouldn't feel they had to sell their bodies. It is not an ideal situation. I don't think it's a good thing, but that's the world we live in. As long as it exists, you have to ask, well, what is the best way to deal with this? I believe making it legal and criminalising half the party involved is just utterly misguided. And it's based on this premise, solely on the premise, that sex workers are the underdog, that they're vulnerable women. In some cases they are, but if you look at, for example, in Amsterdam, there are many sex workers who would argue against making this illegal, and they would argue that they are in a vulnerable position. Like I say, it's not ideal. And one of the arguments as often is, well, if you had a daughter, would you want her in this situation? Of course not. That's why I say I don't think it's ideal. But so long as it does exist, we need to create a situation where these women are safe, or safer, which to me is a very strong argument in favour of legalising it, in which you have controlled zones. I'm not saying it would be perfect, I'm not saying there would never be problems, but having a legally designated zone with secure buildings, where people know what's going on, where there is security, where everyone involved knows the situation, that is bound to be safer than soliciting on the side of streets, dark alleys, that sort of thing. And I think one of the biggest problems here is that the entire argument is being weighed in from the perspective of the sex worker, and not from the perspective of the client. Now, I know that's going to be an unpopular and controversial view, but the client is 50% of the equation. So you cannot pretend that there isn't a perspective to be had. People say, oh, they just want sex. Well, yeah, they do want sex, but you need to examine the reason why. And I believe in many cases it is due to involuntary celibacy. So if you're going to criminalise these men, then you should tackle the root cause, which is they are seeking out a sex worker to end this social stigma that they face. Therefore, it makes sense to me to create a situation whereby they have alternative options. What I would propose is sort of licensed brothels whereby men and women and men I should say, voluntarily sell their bodies for money. It would be sort of legalized prostitution, but it would be more like, I guess you could call it, I don't want to use the word orgy, but you would call it a bit like a swingers club, I guess. And these people would not, these would be people who would have regular jobs. They wouldn't be doing it to try and feed a drug habit or whatever. They would be people who know what they're doing. And I would argue that women who are in this situation should have the right to pay for sex from men who would then sell their bodies as well. I believe you cannot legislate adults on issues like consensual sex. Now, I'm very aware there's issues like people trafficking that need to be cracked down on. This is an evil trade, especially when it involves underage girls. It's an evil, evil business, and you know, the people involved in that should face long prison sentences. But criminalising the clients, especially as in many cases, you cannot expect clients to know the girl's origins. People might say that's naive, but not every sex worker is an underage East European girl. I just think there has to be a situation where, look, sex is a fundamental human desire, and it's always going to be pursued. Making it illegal is just stupid. I strongly support creating a much safer situation for everyone involved. And at the present time, it is the case that these women are vulnerable. And when you hear of violence happening, when you hear of sex workers being raped and so on, it tends to be because it's underground. The women are frightened to approach the police because they believe they'll lose their trade if they do. There's a lot of dynamics involved in this. I believe a lot of the people that believe prostitution should be legal are only looking at it from the surface. They're looking at it, oh, this is terrible, these women are selling their bodies, but they're really not looking at some of the deeper issues, i.e., why are the women in this position in the first place? Why is it that men visit them? And yeah, it's for sex, but there's deeper issues. I just think it's appalling that men who are already suffering from involuntary celibacy, and let me make this very clear, it's no laughing matter. Involuntary celibacy causes immense loneliness, mental anguish, it's a social stigma. Feminists have no comprehension of what it's like. No comprehension whatsoever. They just say, oh, he's a powerful man who's abusing a vulnerable woman by using her for sex. The reality is really not that simple. It's not. So I just think it's morally wrong to punish someone who's already suffering. And I'm not saying that every man who is a client is in that situation, but I believe men who are deserve some sympathy. And I know that will be a controversial opinion, but it just seems unfair to me that we're only hearing one side of this situation. And it's not that I don't think that sex workers, we should see their perspective. Of course we should. Absolutely. But simply vilifying clients isn't going to help anyone. I believe it's morally wrong to just vilify these clients, and that's what this bill does. It simply says, oh, these men are abusing or are taking advantage of these women, let's punish them. I doubt that there was any dialogue at all in this bill about the perspective of the clients and why they do it in the first place, and any sort of alternative as to helping these men find sexual intimacy in another way. Basically, when we're talking about the sex trade, you need to look at both perspectives. You cannot just vilify one side and portray the other side as a victim. And I'm not saying that sex workers aren't often in situations where they are being exploited. I'm not saying that for a second. I'm fully aware of the problem of people trafficking. Like I say, it's an evil trade, but I believe legalizing the sex trade, having it strictly controlled, will maybe not wipe out the criminal side of it, but it will make it a lot harder for them to go underground and to continue operating as they're doing. Because if you have a legal situation, then clients, if a client has a choice between going to a legal brothel, paying for sex and not facing any legal repercussions, or going to a back alley where he is bound to be facing, he's also facing personal risk from the pimps, who are often thugs. So I think it's pretty obvious what the client would choose. And I think a woman involved in the sex trade, if she has a choice between safe house, for want of a better term, which is a legally designated environment, she knows she's not going to be shortchanged, she knows there'll be security there if she faces any problems, or at the hands of a thuggish people trafficker who will force her to do whatever he says, I think her choice would be obvious. In an ideal world, she probably wouldn't be a prostitute. But like I said, this is not an ideal world, and so long as this does exist, you have to look at the lesser evil, so to speak. I think people who believe that making it illegal is going to just wipe the problem out are naive, and only time will tell what this law does. I'm not convinced that it'll help these women. If it does, maybe I'll take back my word on that, but I still think it's wrong to criminalise men for the crime of wanting sexual intimacy. These men aren't rapists. They're not thugs who are abusing these women. They're simply normal guys who, in many circumstances, are desperately lonely. You can laugh all you want, you could stigmatise that, you could call me a sexist, you could say what you want, but in the end of the day, that is a simple reality for many of these clients. And I just don't think it's fair that this aspect isn't spoken about when it comes to legislation. It's a shame that no politician will raise this issue. I'll leave it there.